every action that we do serves us positively, even when it's self-destructive or harming others or harming our life in some way. It's serving you in some manner. And that's another like side of it that you need to try and figure out, because it's not just about replacing or changing the behavior, because if it was filling a need or being driven by a certain motivation, it's always going to come back in a different way.
What if the key to transformation lies in shifting your perspective? Hi, I'm Dr. Payal Beri. Welcome to Reframing Perspectives. Every conversation here is about one thing: how empathy changes the way we lead, connect, and create impact. Each episode, we get to explore deep, authentic conversations designed to expand your mindset. Whether you're looking to transform your leadership, deepen your relationships within your circle, your community, and friends, or gain clarity in your own personal growth, each episode will inspire you to see things differently and take action. If you're ready to challenge your thinking and embrace transformation, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. If you're an entrepreneur, if you are someone who started working and building a business through social media, scaling things, and then you hit rock bottom and you did a 180, Amanda Kolbye is one of the most phenomenal humans that I've connected to. From the first time I spoke to her and on this podcast episode, it's just been so real. At the age of 27, she makes her first $1 million. And she helps thousands of women start and scale online businesses while she's traveling the world full time. Her entire business, she's like in Spain, she's in Germany, she's in Costa Rica, she's in Indonesia, she's everywhere. But she took a full year off, a total sabbatical, completely hit pause, and had to address all the things from burnout and mental health, physical health issues. She was forced to put into a position because trauma, sadly, it's something that if we keep pushing it away, it will find you. There are very few people who will be as raw and honest about everything that they had to go through in order to help heal themselves and move into a space where they feel truly that they're on that growth journey and that they can come back and serve you again. So today's episode, to me, this was just so special because she really shares about the ins and outs about what it's like to grow a business, but also, and more importantly, what it's like to reinvent yourself and recreate your entire life when you have to shake everything off because of what you've created. It's really powerful.
Hi, Amanda.
Hello, how are you?
I'm so good now that I'm talking to you. I have been following you for years and just seeing like your incredible work that you do. The reason I'm so excited about talking to you is because you did something so publicly as well, where you're just like, yeah, I built this multi-7-figure business, but F it, I'm going to go live my life and burn everything down and I'll see you when I see you. And I think that there's
put it that way.
and also when I'm traveling the world, something that, again, is a big risk of its own that people are like, how do I do that? And you've come back, you've got this beautiful smile on your face. You look like you're glowing. Like, there just seems to be a little bit more of a reset in you. And I'm so excited to dig into all of that because I think that there's a lot to talk about when it comes to people who go into the world of building a business, who go into the world of, oh, I'm going to have freedom of life and time and all this stuff. It's like, it's not as easy as what you think it is, and to do and take the risks that you have. So
yeah. It's so many factors at play, so nuanced. Before we even dive in, I just want to say that everything I share, we share, I share as examples, not as the truth, because I think whether it's business or life and personal development, I took so many things as truth of like, if she did that, then I'm going to do that to get there. And I think most people mean well in what they share, but I just want to preface that in that there really isn't this one answer, regardless of what we're talking about, business, life, trauma, like any of it. And the sooner you accept that and really work to figure out your answer and your truth in the midst of taking in all of these conversations or opinions, that's that's going to be the answer. So I know that was a little almost like vague, mysterious before we dive in, but I felt called to say it. So
no, I'm so glad you said that, because I think that when people are in their most vulnerable state, that's when they're listening to podcasts, reading books, and going out there because they're just seeking for someone just tell me what to do. They're so exhausted, so burnt out, and there's just so much happening, and overconsumption, overstimulation that's also happening, that it's like you don't even realize that this desire to consume everything to get an answer is exactly what's causing you to not have an answer.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Just the endless scrolling, which we all hear and roll our eyes. And then I'm still in bed at 2 a.m., doing. So like, I'm not preaching from a mountaintop fully, but.
Yeah. So I want to go back to, before we even dive into like what happened this year and, with you taking this massive time off for yourself, like, I want to take it back a further of like how you even grew up, what led you to like the life that you had growing up? Like, what were your perspectives of the world before you went on this journey of like traveling for 7 years and all this stuff that you did? But what was your perspective of the world? What you thought was the norm, what you thought was this is how you're supposed to do. These are the shoulds. This is the outline of life. And you follow that plan.
Ooh, okay. Such a good question. I'm like, where do we begin? So I grew up, like, for preface, had a mom who ended up staying home because my dad's job took us a lot of different places, and had a little brother, just to like paint the scenes there. And I always tell people, I'm like, the beginning of my childhood it didn't feel to me out of the ordinary. It was fine. We weren't super poor, weren't super rich. I liked moving around as a kid. For me, it was exciting. But the older I've gotten, the more I like now can see things with my parents that were impacting me and the stress in the household. And, you live in your own world as a kid.
Yeah.
So I would say the biggest things for me was I was always an achiever. And I think some things we can pinpoint that we saw examples of, and others, however the mixture created you, it was there. But like both my parents are really, really smart, very driven. My dad, his entire life was his career. He was an FBI agent. And so, as a kid too, you think that's really cool. You're like, wow,
Right.
Yeah. And that was his whole existence. My mom gave up her career because she couldn't sustain one with how much we moved and did all of this stuff.
Right.
But she is now a CFO. So she is, brilliant. But I took that drive into sports, into school. I was the very classic, like perfectionist type A, if you want to put like labels on it, kid, color-coded agenda in, elementary school. And I remember a lot of things where I grew up around mostly boys. I'm the only girl in my family. So I was always the like, well, I can do it too. So I played like actual football because my dad was also a like college football star. And so like, he would do that. I played every sport under the sun. And I think even at a young age, like I learned that you got praised for accomplishing, but I was also the easy child compared to my siblings. They got a lot of attention for other things. And so I was always kind of feeling like I was on my own, I was okay, and I was just achieving things. But I also feel like I grew up with a cool perspective because of my dad's job and because of moving around a lot. I lived in so many different areas of the United States. We lived abroad for a short amount of time. So I do think I didn't realize it, but that really opened my eyes to more of a global perspective, to the point where I had an aunt tell me that even when I was like 10 years old, I told her I'm going to live abroad when I'm older, which I don't even remember that.
So first of all, so many parallels. So I grew up as a third culture kid. Like before moving to the States when I was 10, like we moved around a ton. And, I grew up in Egypt, in Iraq, and in Dubai, in Australia. And then my welcome to America was Queens, New York. And it was like, Queens, New York, Florida, like Jersey, all of it. And so I can 100% relate to this. It really changes your perspective of the world and how you, at a very young age, start to like understand people and how to understand like how to engage with different people. Do you feel like because of the way that you grew up, like moving around as much as you did, like how did you find your sense of belonging, your sense of home, you know?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I don't remember questioning it when I was younger. As I've gotten older, it's become like a very weird questioning for me because I liked moving around. I was very social, outgoing, so I loved making new friends. I was in theater and sports. I was like I did speaking competitions since an early
Wow.
age. Like I don't know who
Yeah.
I was, but like I made movies, so I was very good with people. Um, but the older I got, the more I started to realize, I think when you go to college and then after and you're more intimate with other people, you're like, oh, that's weird. I've never left the butter out. Like I put the butter in the fridge. You
Yeah.
realize these small nuances.
Little
But one
thing.
of them for me was this idea of home. And I had such a tumultuous um, childhood as well that I obviously haven't quite touched on per se, that I left. Like my whole goal for as long as I can remember was to run as fast and as far away as you can. Um, and it wasn't until I started traveling the world that the concept of home really became apparent to me, where I was like, I don't have anywhere to go back to. I have one person in my life who is even in my life familial wise, who's my mom, and I do love her. But where she lives is not where I grew up. I have no attachment to it. In fact, I don't like where she lives. I don't have a group of friends I grew up with. So I literally, in the entire world, these were like things that started making me feel so lonely. I was like, I've been everywhere. There's not a single place in the world I feel comfortable or that's mine, that I identify with, that I feel attached to. And while I'm not going to overly claim that Spain now feels like that after a few months, because I think that would be very exaggerative, it was a feeling when we came to Spain and why we decided to move here, where I had never felt it in my entire life, of like, oh, this feels like where I'm supposed to be. So yeah, I've definitely struggled with that.
So how do you, like with that, because that same thing, like I grew up in so many different places that it changes your perspective of like, and for me, it's always been, I have a 5-year itch. Like after 4 or 5 years, like I got to go somewhere else and I got to go somewhere else. And so, I never claim that anything is forever because I just don't think anything is forever. But how do you help people, who come to you and look at your life and maybe romanticize your life a little bit with, the way that you travel or we're traveling a lot and building this business? How do you help people realize like the reality also of living a more nomadic life, especially for someone who has grown up in the same suburb and never left it, maybe went off for college, but at some point came back. And now they just want to like, they're ready for something different. They just are like, I need to explore the world. Like, how do you help them understand the realities of that?
So on one hand, I absolutely try and be honest about the just very black and white kind of logistical, non-sexy elements of the lifestyle, which I'm happy to name a few. But I think the more important part that I try and help people realize is whatever your story is, personality, kind of all the mixtures that make you you, whether you're conscious of it or not, we're all seeking something. We all need something different that provides us kind of that edge of growth or expansion or a way to challenge us. Or maybe we are coming from a place of challenge and need a place of reprieve. And not that everything always has to be that deep, but I do think that's really what at the core is. Because for me, for example, I absolutely wanted to see the Thai islands and the temples, and I love that. It makes me feel alive in many ways. But I think in many other ways, I was running. I was doing what I always knew how to do. And the dopamine hit of 1 to 2 months in one place and then going to a next, you don't have to deal with a lot of the same mundane or other elements of a life that you would have to. So whether we're talking about the logistics or not, right? Like I started to realize, like I remember being in Santorini, looking over, the very like picturesque white buildings. Yeah. I had just made, a high cash month, and I was so stressed. I was so burnt out. I was so anxious. And I just remember vividly like looking over that and just feeling empty. And I've had so many of those moments. And it took me a while, but I basically realized like you come with you everywhere you go, you come with you. And that's not going to be the lesson everyone needs to learn, but it was one of the lessons I needed to learn because I had escaped by running for many years. That solved my problems until it didn't. And I kept going. I kept thinking, well, maybe when we just do this or when we settle in Bali and slow down, that will make it better. And it's like, it only got worse. None of the locations fix your internal problems. You project whatever your issues are onto the world around you.
Yeah. And that's exactly where it's like, there's so many times people will be like, once I move, then I'll be happy. Once I get that job, then I'll be happy. Once I make this much money in my business, then I'll be happy. Right. And it's like, I was just thinking when you said it, is that moving around so much and kind of creating this life of like, look at me on the go. It's like, you literally are on the go. Like you are literally, a fugitive of your own emotional self. And you're running from your, internalized like healing work that you've got to do. So what was that moment like when everything just like, you just realized that moment, like, I can't keep going because of like, I'm not facing this. Like, it was just, I always say it's like, you can keep running. But if you don't face it, the universe is going to make you face it.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I'm one of those people. Hands up. If anyone's not watching the video version, you can join me. I am a very determined person, and on the flip side, a very stubborn person, which is my biggest blessing and curse in life. And so I didn't realize this in time. The universe forced me hard to listen to the phrase, if you don't listen to the whispers, you'll be forced to hear the screams. That pretty much defines my life. So COVID was kind of the first like event for me, as it was difficult for everyone, but we were locked down in Malaysia and it was a much stricter lockdown than a lot of the West. And so my business was really taking off at the time and I just kind of threw myself into work. I felt like a lot of work, but I was in it. I was happy. It was exciting, yada, yada. But the after effects of that caught up to me very quickly, where I would say at that point in time was when I first started experiencing burnout. But I didn't stop. I didn't listen to it. And a lot of things.
What did burnout look like for you though, right in the beginning? What were the initial symptoms of burnout? What were the initial signs of burnout that you were starting to notice?
I was exhausted. I was drained. No matter how much rest I had, or you lost the fire, the spark, the motivation. And not that every day is ever going to feel like the most exciting day in the world, but if anyone's experienced that, there's a difference. And it's not just a day, it's not just 2 days. It's all of a sudden your norm where you are just drained physically, mentally, just like your soul feels drained. And I'd say that's the biggest part. There's a lot of fatigue. A lot of times you'll start to experience internal issues, potentially more, which I did, but at the time I couldn't tell that, nor did I know it. So I'd say that was probably the biggest one.
Yeah. And so you were, I paused you in the middle of your sentence, but that part right there is like, I think about this a lot because in our American culture, right? Like you were saying, like, your dad defined his identity by his work, right? You took on a lot of maybe that, seeing that in your home, that accomplishments are where you get recognized. So now I have to just keep accomplishing. You being the easy child is almost like, I don't want to give trouble, so let me just take care of me, being the independent, typical, first child, right? And so it's all of those things that have become so normalized here in the US. Like I have a friend who, she works in the hospital setting and she wasn't feeling well. And she was so upset that she was not allowed to go into work that day because of how many minimal days that she has to take off from time. So because of that, she was so upset that she had to rest. And the idea of that, right? Like just that basic concept that our basic things that are good and healthy for us as humans is now completely distracted with like work being your identity. And when you're a business owner, you can't help it, especially in the early years. Like it really does become all consuming because you were trying to build something. It's unpredictable. You don't know what's happening. You have to pivot with what's happening in the economy, what's happening with, the politics of the world, like all of that. So for you, moving abroad, the world and different parts of the world operate differently. They don't all necessarily think about work as the center of the universe. They look at it as a means. They look at it as a part of your life. But it's not that. So obviously you were traveling, but because you were hopping from place to place, you probably didn't necessarily allow yourself to see that part of the world, but you were exposed to it. So what has that been like for you to being able to decenter work?
It's been interesting because as a nomad, yes, you're living in these different countries and you absolutely experience cultural elements, but you're typically in a place for quite a short period of time that you still exist in a lot of a bubble. So I absolutely gained so much insight from all these cultures, but I think from the like work identity and hustle mode, kind of all that's drilled into you perspective, I wasn't looking for opinions. I wasn't looking for anything different. So that didn't influence me really at all. I was very much just laser focused on my own and looping it back into kind of what you were saying and almost your original question of like, what were the perspectives that you grew up with? Like I grew up with the mentality of like, not only of achievement and all of these other things, but the parts we haven't fully gotten into, just in short, like my dad left in a very, hard way. He was abusive. So it was an abusive household and things got like a lot worse than they were. There were a lot of things at play, but I remember being a 12-year-old girl and telling myself I will never rely on a man for money because he left us high and dry overnight. We became like homeless, had no food, like all of this stuff, very extreme. And that was a driving force when you look at like, what were the perspectives? Like I didn't want any other opinions. Like I truly believed, while you don't say it out loud because it sounds bad, I believed I was better than everyone else, not because of I had made X amount of money or something, but because I worked harder, because I worked longer, because I was willing to do whatever it took to get there. And I would never have said this out loud because it's one of those thoughts that just kind of like ruminates, but it truly was like fueled me when other people are like, wow, how do you do so much? Like that was almost like fire to me because I was like, yeah, that makes me better. That is what defined as the best. And I can't stop because I'm afraid I will lose it. I can't rely on anyone else. And there was never this safety. Like safety was what I was after, while again, I couldn't recognize it at the time. So no one could influence me, not a country, not a person, not a partner, for better or worse.
Wow, that's really powerful what you just shared. How much do you feel then? It's like, it sounds almost like the anger that you held for what happened when you were 12, like was literally the rocket fuel to your success. And, I always say like, sometimes it's like whatever trauma we experience or whatever we go through, it's like that can be our rocket fuel to get us to a certain point. And then at a certain point, we've got to be able to address what that is doing, because it's not going to keep you going, right? Like it's like allows you to hide for a certain amount of time. But what did that mean for you? Like when, that whole statement right there of, I'm never going to be financially reliant on a man. Like I'm never going to be in that situation. And I'm going to take this conversation into a whole other side right now, because I think I really want to know your perspective on this, is that we see this like rise in trad wife. We see this rise in, what it means to be reliant. Like, it's like, I want to be soft, and that whole, there's a meme about it, right? It's just like, a strong man lets a woman be soft or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's just, how do you then kind of find that space? Like you have your partner. And so how do you find that space of releasing maybe that idea that I'm never going to be reliant on a man from a place of anger or like hatred, and more from a place of like, I'm going to be self-sufficient because I believe in myself, and, share this partnership with this person that we're building together?
Yeah. Ooh, that's such a good question. So I would say, like, to me, what you're describing, which is just such a phenomenal concept, you can apply this to kind of any belief or action, is getting to the root, not necessarily why it happened. I think that can be very helpful, but I also think it can sometimes keep us dwelling on the past in certain situations. But it's really insightful to understand why you do what you do. And this is really hard to uncover, whether you need help journaling. I mean, there's lots of ways to go about it. But the reason it's so hard is because we're very good at tricking ourselves, because 95% of our operating system, if you will, is subconscious. And I mean, that was it for me as well. I couldn't fully recognize all of these things. I didn't realize how blind I was, right? And most people don't. And so for me, the why, like you're saying, it was more of this, I need to prove myself. It was more of this anger, more of this running, that was what I was getting out of it. That was both what I was seeking, and every action that we do serves us positively, even when it's self-destructive or harming others or harming our life in some way. It's serving you in some manner. And that's another like side of it that you need to try and figure out, because it's not just about replacing or changing the behavior, because if it was filling a need or being driven by a certain motivation, such as for me to kind of say, F you to the men, or, whatever it is, even if I changed my behavior, if I never address that core wound or need or motivation, it's always going to come back in a different way. And so that has been the story of my life that I couldn't realize until these last few years, is everything that was my coping mechanism or my vice that was healthy for a short period of time became the thing that almost destroyed me. And it's happened multiple times. And my work was the same, where on paper, you do glorify or reward people for hard work and for achievement and for all these things. And on paper, they're not bad, right? But when you look at the motivation or how it was controlling me, because I was not in the driver's seat. That belief and that drive in a toxic way was controlling me, because that need was so strong that it started off very positively until I actually fell into an addiction cycle with work, which I've dealt with addiction multiple times in my past, but with other elements. I couldn't stop. I wasn't in control anymore. And that has how the other addictions played out, except I had never looked at them that way, that they were the thing that saved me to almost then destroy me, because I just looked at it as, oh, well, I've never dealt with that specific addiction again in my life. Therefore, I conquered it. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And, when you have an addictive personality, it's like you're literally chemically always looking for the next thing to replace that, to soothe that. So how are you with, let's take it back again to when you had that moment of like, I can't keep going like this. Like you're in freeze, like you're in a state of freeze and you just cannot move forward anymore. Those first initial months of having to like even acknowledge that piece, right? Like that is in itself is scary. It's the withdrawal part of addiction. And it's the anger phase you go through and the grief phase. Like you have all those phases you go through. And at the same time, I remember like your dad passed away. Mm-hmm. And so you're living abroad, your dad is passing away, you're going back to a country that you're just like, I don't want to be here. And you're dealing with your own set of, identity work that you're having to get through. What was that like in that moment?
Yeah. So I feel like to answer that, I have to give a little nod to what was happening before that. So mm-hmm. I mentioned I, burned out quite early on. This is COVID times, but I didn't stop. So that kept getting worse. My both physical and mental health got worse. I had some incidences that actually brought up PTSD. So I started having to deal with that, as well as panic attacks, which I hadn't dealt with for years. So things were kind of like getting worse. And we were like, okay, you know what? We need some help. And we moved to Austin for 6 months to get some therapy and some stuff like that, and like try to slow down, which I'm using air quotes for those on audio. And, the therapy was great. I started learning some things, but it only got me so far. And as soon as we could, we got out again, right? We started the traveling, the nonstop, everything. And I was like kind of adjusting my business in a way that I thought was going to help everything. But it was kind of like the river was already rushing, and it wasn't going to be just this small, like off course, like side course that I needed to turn. So anyways, that kind of kept spiraling, and we had gotten to Bali, and we were like, you know what, we're going to stay here for 6 months, slow down. Bali is the place I was like, I had gone to a meditation retreat, all this stuff. And a week after we'd got there and kind of been like, this is our breath of fresh air, we can like finally get our feet under you, was when we got the call that my dad had terminal cancer out of the blue. And he's super fit, all this stuff. I mean, no one would have expected it. And then a week later, my partner lost his job, which is relevant because I was like, you know what, I'm going to take 2 months off, and I'm going to kind of half rely on my partner to support me. And I definitely was not able to do that. So that like fed that. But the part that kind of transformed all this, to answer your question, is the fact that I didn't have a relationship with my dad. So he continued to be abusive even when I went back and saw him on his deathbed. He just couldn't see the world differently, couldn't see me differently. So I went back reluctantly to say, you know what, I'm going to have no regrets. But I ended up having to stay there for 6 months, essentially waiting for him to die, which some of this sounds a bit crass, but for me was the reality. And I tried to see him, but every day of my existence there was like torture. I was like, I'm not getting to live the life I want. I don't want to be here. I don't want to even like see this man. Like, I'm trying to do the right thing. Every time I see him, it's horrible. And so it was the biggest relief for me when he died, which again is, I know, a very bold statement to make, but I actually did mushrooms that summer for the first time in a therapeutic setting. And that for me, I think, was the catalyst for all of these ahas that led to the sabbatical and a bunch of shit that had happened throughout the multiple years kind of coming to a halt. And I got the message that was like, this business isn't what you're supposed to do. And at the time I could not accept that message. I was like, haha, this is probably funny. Like, everyone gets these weird messages. And I also experienced my dad's death as actually dying and being buried, but it was very beautiful. I was like in a forest. I could feel the rain. I was outside at the time, and I experienced his death before he had died as a rebirth. And to this day, I would never have wished the past few years upon anyone, but I have viewed his death as the only gift that he has ever given me in life, because as looping back to what I said earlier, I'm very stubborn, and the universe was going to have to force me to slow down and stop. And this was probably one of the only things that really made me stop, because I'd tried to slow down before, but this halted me in my tracks. It turned my entire world upside down. It made me face everything that I thought had been dealt with and buried for many years. And while I'm not necessarily fully on the other side of it all, I don't know if you ever are fully on the other side. I can say I'm so thankful for his death and everything that happened the way it happened, because I got a second chance at life, is truly how I view it, through all the work that I ended up doing on my sabbatical and just on my own personal journey because of the disruption.
Wow. That really sounds like I could actually, like, I'm a visual person. So when you were talking about being in the forest and the river, like, I can actually visually like feel like I can see that. That's really powerful to think of. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, people put other humans on a pedestal, and especially as kids, we're guilted into thinking our parents are these like godly role models, right? And that we should feel bad if we think even anything bad about them. But it's like, they're human. They're a person. They also have their own wounds. They also have their own things. And sadly, there's some who are never able to overcome that. And so it's like, you can have empathy, you can have compassion for like, I get why you are the way you are, but I don't necessarily need to be on the receiving end of that. And, you being there for 6 months, waiting for him to pass away, and for you to take the time also for like this big catalyst to happen, doing mushrooms and all of those pieces. It's just that it really does sound like it's like you were able to actually completely have like another like Amanda part two. Like it's a version two. It's like this version and everything that was linked, the cord that was there, that, that was like linking me to this part of my life that I was never able to fully release. It's like his death did that for you.
Yeah, it did. And I will say it obviously wasn't this passive thing, right? Where because of the death, just for everyone listening too, if you're relating this in whatever way it can to maybe your own situation, like it was the work and the depth and commitment to doing the work, which I've been in rehab before. I've been in therapy since I was very young. I thought I'd done the work. And I think in many ways, I don't want to discredit that, and that I did do a lot of work, but I'd never done self-work at this level before. And my entire world, when I shut down my business as well, right after my dad's death, I was unwell, not because of his death, because of everything that came together.
Right.
I mean, that was it. Like that was my identity. That was what I had killed myself to build. And a part of me knew or felt like I had killed myself to get here, and I don't know if I can do it again. And I can't do it again. It's going to have to be in a different way, but that's for the best. But it was really I did some therapy retreats that were very intensive, like somatic release therapy. I did ketamine therapy. I did a bunch of stuff that really took me down to the core. And through this culmination of the work and the crumbling, not only did my world crumble, my sense of self crumbled. Yeah. And that has been the most terrifying and liberating experience to this day of my entire life, that I have kept going, had I have treated burnout and then just kind of run to the next thing, like I never would have gotten here to where I have stripped away every piece of my identity and sense of self. And it's about relearning, well, who am I actually? For a very simple example, I'm not actually as type A as I kind of painted myself to be. A lot of people online know me as like the systems, and I'm all organized, color coded, and that's in there. But I'm actually, if we have to put a label on it, I'm actually much more type B. I fuel via the creative, the spontaneous. I'm actually a very impulsive person. And a lot of things. So that's a very kind of fun example, but it is, I think it's the goal. I think the goal is to allow maybe things to crumble, even though it's the last thing any of us want, in order to get to know the real you, which in turn helps you learn, well, what do I actually want? And how am I motivating myself? Like we talked about before, not from the factors that I don't even know about that are controlling me in my life. How do I actually take back the driver's seat? And you can't do that by just going on top of what already exists. You do truly have to excavate and face the skeletons in the closet.
How do you do that though, where if you're not in a place or situation that you can take a sabbatical, like financially, that there are people that are like, well, I can't just stop. Like I am the breadwinner. Like I have to pay these bills. Don't have enough money saved up for me to take that time off and do these things. What is something that like they can take from this?
Yeah. Very small first thing I want to say that I won't get into is I want you to challenge that statement first. I absolutely acknowledge that is a very hardcore reality that does exist for many people. So I'm not trying to discredit that, but I want to push you to challenge that statement of I can't, just because I said I can't. But it wasn't because I couldn't actually, it's because I didn't like the way it was going to have to happen.
Right.
Putting that part aside, though, I think you have to try and figure out maybe what it is you need. What is controlling you, I think is a really good question. I mean, therapy is absolutely very helpful. I'm a huge advocate for therapy, but for me, the biggest thing that helped was somatic work, just to cut to the chase. So therapy is very intellectualized, and that's where I thrive, right?
It stays in that part where it's like you're not doing the work in the body and the feelings that are stored within. And so, I used to be a clinical therapist, right? And when I was doing clinical therapy and practicing that and doing, anyone who would mention anything else, like I was definitely indoctrinated to that thinking like, but this is so healing and everything. It's like, no, therapy just kind of keeps you in the same space. Like I will say that once you figured out your initial why, there's so many other modalities that can work. And I think this idea also with therapy is a westernized modality. And so it doesn't necessarily support, other cultural norms, and being able to acknowledge that there are different ways to heal is okay. We don't all have to, again, going back to there's not one way of healing. Yeah.
No, and you're spot on. And I think because I've spent the majority of my time the last 7 years while hopping around, the majority of it was in Southeast Asia. And I've been fascinated by the cultures, the religion, spirituality elements, all of that. Like that to me has been the coolest thing to soak in from people's perspectives. And so I was actually specifically looking for a solution where kind of East meets West in what I wanted. I wanted some people to guide me with that background in therapy and trauma and all of this stuff, but I wanted the spiritual element, what we label a lot of times as woo element to come in, because I was like, just talking about it's not working. Like I'll try anything. And so some of the things I did that I think you have to try and figure out what works best for you, but like EFT tapping, meditation, although trying to just sit down and meditate as a very hyper, anxious type person is very difficult. And that's probably not what you need. You probably need to get the energy out, not sit in it. But that was very helpful. So somatic was really, at the end of the day, what helped me most. I do think for me personally, psychedelic therapy has been really amazing, but I don't think it would have been as helpful had I have not done a lot of the work alongside or pre-doing it to have things bubbling and feel ready enough while you don't feel ready, but I was ready enough to face certain things in that environment. But somatic is what I want to preach from the rooftops. And somatic, soma means body. So somatic therapies, which there's multiple approaches and all this stuff within it, but it's really about the body and releasing, especially specifically trauma from the body, because trauma is stored in the body, which I'm going so surface level with this to keep it brief, but I screamed, shouted, shaked, danced, everything to get it out. And that's not doing it service, but it changed my life. I do it every day, to varied extents. And there are different tools and simple modalities in that you can do to calm the anxiety or the racing thoughts, or to properly release it from your system. Like we talk about carrying this weight in a backpack. I've never been able to put the backpack down. I've just been able to ignore it or get used to it until I did somatic therapies.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I think sometimes people get nervous to go that deep and actually truly face those, internalized beliefs and identities is because what it also means and how it's going to literally disrupt everything else in your life as well. It's going to not just disrupt the work part, but it's going to disrupt your friendships, your relationships, right? People who are going to wonder, what just happened to her? That's not the person I know. And it's no, it's not the person you know. I've been living a facade, or I've been living this other version. I've been on for everyone else, right? I've been on for me because I had to mask all of this in order to just survive. And, you'll get everything from you're being so dramatic to it's not that bad. You live such a privileged life. You live this, you live that. And it's there's so much of all of these other things that you have to grieve along with grieving, releasing this version of yourself. And I think that is a legitimate fear that people have of I'm going to lose everything. But it's I was just talking to someone else earlier, and it's just in order to have the rise of, right, the phoenix. It's like, you got to burn everything down. And it is scary. So like, what was that like for you? Like with the relationships in your life and with everything that has shifted? I mean, your partner has been with you for a very long time. How has that impacted with everything you've gone through?
I just want to echo everything you said. Like that's the hardest part of all of this. You can't even understand what that statement means until you've been there. And I think it's the bravest thing anyone can do is to allow the crumbling or dive into it, because it goes against everything you've ever known. Like it's not, I don't want to sugarcoat it and be like, well, it'll be okay. It's like, no, it will eventually. It's going to be better than it ever was, but it will change everything. But it's for the best. Like I've never felt peace before in my life. I've never felt joy. I mean, those are weird, bold statements, and those are my edges, right? Your edges will be different, but relationships were big. For me as the nomadic life, I think my environment with relationships is probably very different than a lot of other people's, because I had virtual relationships, but moving around, you don't really have the regular ones. So I really didn't have a ton of like close friends at the time, but I didn't have the capacity to be a friend. I didn't have the capacity, especially in the midst of the changing time frame where I was losing myself and going through it. It's so much to process that you really need a lot of space. Like you need to do whatever you can, in my opinion, to communicate what realistically you can contribute or be available for. And the people that understand it will understand it. But whether it's boundaries or this or that, you have to put you first. This is going to be a time of your life, if you're going through a period like this, where you have to put you first, because otherwise it's going to drag on. And the more that you can go into it and give yourself what you need and trust that when you come back, you're going to take what is hanging around, the people that are still hanging around, maybe the parts of your life, and you'll work with that, and you trust that it will be better. That's kind of what you have to go off of. With my partner, I feel very, very lucky. We've been together almost 10 years now, and we've been through a lot on both of our sides of things. But I think the part that I've realized is most valuable is that we've been able to grow together, because had we have not both been people that not only were receptive to work together, but to grow together and see those new perspectives and be open enough to all of it and support each other, we wouldn't still be together. And I think the more I look at relationships, specifically romantic ones, I think that's really where things work or don't. And yes, there's all these other factors that influence it, but you're not going to be the same person in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And for any relationship to evolve that way, it has to do just that. It has to evolve, not how do we hold on to what was. So the day I got back from the somatic retreat that I went to this spring during my sabbatical, that was the big one that kind of really catapulted things, I said, you have to go to this, to my partner. Mm-hmm. And I said, no, but like, you have to go to this now. I've done everything. I've tried everything. This changed my entire life. And he got on the computer. He looked up the same like company, and the next retreat was actually starting the next week in the UK. And he signed up, got the last spot. And 4 days later, he flew out and went to the retreat. And I think the last thing I want to say on that, unless you have other questions of it though, is you'd think he came back from the retreat and we were both enlightened and blah, blah, blah. And it was all happy. It was actually the exact opposite, because in doing the work, we both had to find our own edges, our own muck, and bring it up to the surface, which makes you start questioning, like, you're not going to solve everything in a week, no matter what retreat or whatever you go to. So it actually made our relationship very volatile in a healthy way, right? It wasn't toxic, but it was not fun. Mm-hmm. And I would even say we're still figuring out those pieces. We're going to couples therapy, all of these things, just to figure out how do we be our best selves and support the other person in our best selves. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really powerful. I love the fact that like, even for him to go and come back, it's like he's going to come back with other things that are going to have happen because, again, you're two different humans. Like, regardless of the fact of being in a relationship and knowing each other so well, it's like his muck and your muck are going to look very different. And I do think, and I think it's really important, is the fact that you have in some form or fashion been involved in doing personal healing work throughout your life. And so I think that, for someone who's just getting started on their journey and for someone who maybe in the middle of it or whatever it is, it's like, got to pay attention to like where you're at and what you need in that moment. And I am 100%, in belief that somatic, ayahuasca, ketamine, like all of these things can absolutely work. But it's like the timing of it really does also play a massive factor. And,
Yes.
how is this? And what I also think is so critical is letting the people that are around you. So if you're married or if you have a partner or, you live with your family or you've got kids, it's like there has to be some level of involvement that they need to understand what this is going to do for like when you come back from it or like, when you're going through it, because it is going to disrupt their life. And so to think that this is only my journey is actually a very like, again, insular way. It's like, yes, like you have to go through the journey, but there's other people who will be affected by it too.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do you bring them along the ride as much as they possibly can, and then like rectifying it after.
Yeah. And I acknowledge that I have, for lack of a better term, a lot of privilege in this arena and that I did work for myself and had control. I had a partner who has had a salary while I was on sabbatical. I don't have kids, right? So I absolutely acknowledge all these things. And also, I have been in the same rooms doing this work in varying degrees with many people who have a 9 to 5, who have kids, who have all these other things. And so I think every situation is different, but I do think you have to let people in on what's going on, and you'll be the judge to know how much and who you can tell. But I would
Yeah.
really encourage anyone, if you're deciding to go on this journey, start with one thing. It's not going to be like one retreat or therapy fixes it all. It really is a journey, and there is a shift that happens, but there's not necessarily a finish line. But the more that you can let people in, the more they can understand. So, I mean, I've dealt with depression, not being able to get out of bed, all these things, and I didn't want to tell anyone else. I didn't want to burden everyone, but that actually hurt a lot of my friendships and things because we all have our own narratives in our head. And so I would have friends being like in their head, I eventually found out like, oh, well, she doesn't like me and she doesn't care about me. And, it's all kind of happening in the background. And so I think even kids, and your kids in different ages, but I think kids are a lot smarter than we give them credit for and a lot more perceptive as to what's going on. And so I would even say that specifically if you're a parent, because I'm sure that's one of the first things that is like, how do I navigate responsibilities and telling them, let them in on things. Like, this is real life. Like, you can tailor what you want to tailor that doesn't feel right to share. But I actually think if you are going on this journey and have kids, you have an opportunity to show them how to process emotion and how to heal. And that's something most of us were never shown.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I could talk to you forever about this stuff. Like, your journey has been so powerful. And I think it's just so beautiful how open you are to share all of this, because I think a lot of people do need to hear it. And, we're just in a global scale right now. I feel like there's a lot of things that are just on fire, right? And so there's things that are happening external to us that are on fire that we cannot control. So it's like, how can you then find that healing inside of you? Because otherwise, I think that when you're in that state of your own burnout, your own, madness that's happening internally, and then you're stimulated by what's happening outside, it only exasperates like all of those thoughts that you have within yourself. So It's like, take care of your home first. Like, your house is on fire. You can't go and, pour water on someone else's home. Like, you've got to take care of that home of yours, and your home being your body, your nervous system, your mindset, like all of that thing, because that is going to carry with you for the rest of your life. So I'm curious, like last question for you is what now? What now that, this journey is going to continue on like that. I agree with you. Like it never stops, and who knows if it stops even after you die, if you believe in reincarnation too. So, it's going on with you. But what now in terms of as you're rebirthing yourself into your work, your life in Spain, all of it?
Yeah. I pictured it differently, but didn't we all? It has been a lot more cumbersome to get settled. For me specifically, we moved to a new country, started a new life, got through a visa process, all of this. And I thought it would be a little bit easier and faster than it was. And so that has been a lot to handle. But I think what's been really cool, and as far as what's next, is throughout just as each day passes on, I get to recognize how my operating system has changed. And what I mean by that is how my natural or default approach or thought pattern or perspective is inherently different without me trying to insert it to be different. So, for example, if you walk outside and you're mad at the world for something, right? Like I walked outside and maybe I wasn't mad this time, just very oversimplistic. So that has been really cool. And I think the biggest thing for me of what's next is for me to be intentional, for me to be mindful and watch myself as old patterns come up or old habits come up, because I'm able to be so much more aware of the 95% subconscious that is like ruling in the background, and I'm working on changing all of those. So I'm able to be intentional and aware of, in this really beautiful, well, it doesn't always feel beautiful, space and chance to say, what do you want? Right? Like, who are you? Who do you want to be? What do you want out of life? And I'm in this very deep introspective period at the moment, where I've been so tempted to rush back to a new business or a new business idea. And trust me, it's not just because I'm like sitting on stacks of cash. Like I should really be working again, but I know that I've learned enough that if I don't deal with it, it's going to come to a head eventually. And I've got to do it right this time, no matter what that means. And so I can't tell you one thing that is next. All I know is it's an intentional decision to embrace the slowness, the intentionality behind everything I'm doing, behind the friends I'm surrounding myself, behind my habits, my schedule, my way of doing things, and really get to know myself more even than I have, to say, okay, well, what part of me is driving that thought, right? Before I listen to that, what part of me wants that? Why do I want that? Because everything I've done up to this point, I didn't do that. Most of us didn't do that, right? You were who you were. You had the thoughts you have. You are surrounded by the people that tell you a way life should be, and you do it. And I feel like I'm actually now creating a life that's going to feel like amazing, not just look amazing or be amazing. Versus before I created a life, I quit a corporate job, I traveled the world, on paper it was really sexy. Yeah. But I didn't create a life that was worth living. Like every day felt miserable. Really. I'm sure there were fun days, right? And so I think my biggest focus is I want to feel alive. And that's a challenge every day for me, because I've been so used to being so numb and operating certain ways. So that is the summary point. I guess I'll sum that all up as what's next for me is learning how to feel alive.
Amanda, this has been such a healing conversation for me alone. Like, I'm sure the audience is going to get it, but I feel selfishly like so happy to have this conversation, because it's so true. Like, it's so interesting. Like, as someone who was a therapist, as someone who my work is in empathy and, creating more of that like empathetic world that we live in. But I get caught up in how do I make even bigger impacts, and how do I, do this bigger thing. And it's just like, stop it already, and I look at, the last 18 years of my life and like what I've been able to do. And yet it's like I'll sometimes have the feeling of like, I barely scratched the surface. Like I barely scratched the surface of what I've done. It's like just, you did it. Like, it's okay. And it's like, what's that world between contentment and just trying to do too much? And, why can't we just be happy with what we are giving, like the part, as much as we can give to the world, and also being okay with like taking care of other parts of our life too. So I love that it's like learning to just like be alive and live to be like, living in a live way. So thank you so much for everything that you shared. I'm so excited for the listeners too. I hope they like listen to this conversation 2, 3, 4 times, because whatever, I think that there's just so many things that we covered. And every time you go back to this, I feel like they're just going to hear a different part that's going to be like aha moment for them. So thank you so much for sharing your journey.
Yeah, you're so welcome. And I feel like, just to say one last thing, because I feel like your audience is full of people like you and I that are ambitious and so driven, by so many things. And the ambition doesn't go away, and what you feel called to do doesn't go away, because every day I feel the ambition and all these things that I want to do with my life. I think for me personally, it was this shift only through that journey. It wasn't just a thought, right? I had to experience it, but it was a shift to changing what my belief was for what the point of life is, which I know is a very deep, big question. And then learning how, I hate the word balance, but how to balance that at different points of your life, because it's not so much about balancing it equally. It's about in this season, it's going to look this way. And in the next season, it's going to look this way. And you kind of get to live like so many lives in this lifetime if you allow to kind of fully be in the season you're in, and know that you're still going to get to nurture or achieve or whatever it is in the next one. So I say that just because I know I was afraid of losing my edge and my ambition, and then not accomplishing all the fun things that I did genuinely want. But just accomplishing all those things might feel really cool in some ways to help others, but you have to look back at like, you're the only one that lives your life, and you're living it right now in the midst of whatever it is. And you have to start to focus on you and what it's like to be you. What is it like to be you day to day, minute to minute, when no one is around and no one's listening? Because for me, I described it as a tortured soul. And that's when I realized no matter what I did or what I wore or where I was, what it was like to be me was torturous. And I had to do something different, because I couldn't keep masking that for another, 80 years. I don't know, however long I get to live for.
No, I mean, again, valid point, right? Like I look at it as like adjusting. It's like you're just constantly adjusting to whatever it is. And your ambition and purpose, like, if you're just innately an ambitious person or driven person, like that's not going to go away. Like no one's telling you to just now like sit on the couch and just like become an extra. I will say though, like I say this to my friends all the time. If I existed in the Renaissance period and I was like a male philosopher who talked about existential crisis all the time, like I would kill it. Like that is like my jam. And that is what I would love to be doing all the time, is just questioning life and the existence of life.
Same. But, can I join?
Like secretly, I feel like my podcast is like the inner part of that coming out for me. But it really is that it's redefining what that purpose is. Like purpose can be identified with work, but it can also be identified with like, wow, like I feel driven to like create like a community of like, joy through friends and family. Like I love hosting. And so like hosting events, right? Where like I get to like, I love like, I used to live in Chicago, and I threw a Friendsgiving, and it was like the best. And we were like, we're going to do this as an annual Friendsgiving. And it was like 2019 November. So it was like 2020. And I was like, that was the one and only that ever happened. But it's just, it really is. It's like being driven and ambitious doesn't have to be tied to work. It's just you're driven and ambitious, but that can be tied to like your purpose in life. Like, your purpose with community, your purpose with spirituality, your purpose with whatever it is. It's like filling your cup more than it is, trying to get external validation that you filled a cup.
Yeah, exactly. And question why.
Yeah.
Why do you want that? Why do you want to achieve that? Like, I'm like, we could keep going, but I'll stop us there.
Or serving your self-contentment, right? So it's all of that. But yeah, we could definitely keep going. But thank you again so much, Amanda. I'm so excited for this to come out into the world.
Same. And just thank you for having me on. These are my favorite conversations, and I absolutely love everything you're doing with this podcast. So to everyone listening, thank you. So excited to now have met you and be in your aura, your field or whatever. And I feel like this podcast has such amazing conversation. So if you're listening, you found a good one.
Oh, you're so sweet.
I really hope that you enjoy this episode, and I just have one favor to ask you. If you could just make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review, it's going to help us tremendously to make sure that we reach as many people as possible that you think should be listening to our episodes. I'll see you next week for another episode, and thank you so much for leaving that one review, that one subscription, and sharing this with your friends.